Hello, and welcome to KCS at Home Summer Edition. We are so excited that you have joined us today for this social studies lesson. If this video is hard to understand, you have some options. First, turn on closed captions if available. Adjust the playback speed to slow down the video. Consider watching short clips, then pause, listen, and watch again. Or ask someone in your home to watch the video with you. Stop frequently and talk to your partner about what you heard and understood.
Hello, my name is Michelle Steffi, and I teach government, and I'm going to walk you through the U.S. Government 10th grade Task 1 today to give you an idea of what the task is asking you to do. You should see on the screen the copy of the PowerPoint pulled up. It's entitled The U.S. Constitution. One of the things that is prevalent in our standards for government is the principles of the Constitution. As far as principles of the Constitution, we're talking really about the foundation of the Constitution and what has allowed our Constitution to grow and flourish and be a steady hand throughout the last over 200 years. So the essential question that we're going to tackle in this lesson has to do with those basic principles. So it says, why are the basic principles of the Constitution the most effective way to guarantee the goals established in the preamble of the Constitution? So what the task is going to have you do is go through the PowerPoint, and each slide of the PowerPoint will have something to do with one of the principles. It's going to start us out, once we get past the first couple of slides, taking a look at the basic goals of the Constitution. These 6 goals are found in the very first of the Constitution in the preamble. So in breaking down the goals, I just want you to think about what was it that the founders, as they were putting together the articles of the Constitution, were trying to accomplish. So the goals are the things that the Constitution is supposed to accomplish. So in the goals, we know that they want to form a more perfect union. They want to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and ensure the blessings of liberty. So what follows in the Constitution in Articles 1 through 7 are going to be ways for us to be able to achieve these goals. So if we want to form a more perfect union, they are talking about moving past the Articles of Confederation, and how do we make sure that the relationship between the federal government and the states is stronger? How do we ensure that government is moving towards a common goal? So the goals in the goals in the preamble are the things that this Constitution was supposed to achieve. So essentially, the essential question, I should say, I guess, is that you're looking at the principles to see how they may achieve these goals. The principles that you're going to look at involve the following. You're going to I know that on the PowerPoint it talks about the fact that you would be working in a group. This is what I would do in the classroom, is I would probably have groups of students take a look at the different goals of the Constitution first and see if they could put those goals in their own words, and you're welcome to do that as well. See if you can establish what those goals might mean and maybe give some examples of those goals as you move along. What you're going to do, though, for the principles is that once you get to this point in the PowerPoint, I'm going to back off here for just a second, and I'm going to bring up the other worksheet that you're going to see. You should also find this in Task 1. This is the guided notes that go along with the PowerPoint. So once you get to the portion of the PowerPoint that says 7 principles of the Constitution, I want you to utilize this graphic organizer. You should be able to use the PowerPoint notes to fill in the descriptions of the principles and it also will give you some examples. And the slide should also tell you where that principle is found. So I'll run back through really quickly the PowerPoint slides just to kind of give you an overview of what those principles are talking about. But as you're going through the PowerPoint on your own, utilize this graphic organizer to take your notes so that you can reference that when you get to the activity just a little bit later. So let me switch back to the PowerPoint. From this portion of the PowerPoint is where you're going to start to utilize that graphic organizer. And the principles are not in any specific order on the PowerPoint, so you may have to flip back and forth on the sheet. But you're going to find the 7 basic principles of government on the PowerPoint itself. The first principle of government is going to be popular sovereignty. And I also want you to notice that on the PowerPoint, it is highlighted for you to help you kind of pick out the segments that are more detailed for that graphic organizer. So if I were wanting to describe this principle, I'm going to use power to rule comes from the people. That's what popular sovereignty is defined as. And I'm also going to look at the fact that what it means is going to be consent of the governed. The other portion of what is highlighted can kind of tell you where it can be found. So for example, popular sovereignty is the idea that within our system of government, the true power of government lies with the people themselves. So they have the power in a democracy. We have learned that in the idea of John Locke when he talks about that government can't exist without the consent of the governed. And we find an example of that within our Constitution when we look at the preamble itself. So when we go back, if I were to go back a few slides to the goals, and we were to look at the very first words of the preamble, it would say, we the people, all right? So we the people is the example of popular sovereignty. And we can find it within the Constitution itself in the preamble. Another principle of the Constitution is going to be republicanism. Republicanism is this idea of being able to vote for a representative. We have a very large democracy in the United States. And one of the concerns of the founders was, how were we going to operate with such a large republic? And they made the argument early on that republicanism would be the way that we could function as a large republic. And when you have over 300 million people in your population and are citizens of the United States, it's very hard to have a direct democracy. So republicanism is the idea that we go to vote. And when we vote for individuals who are going to represent us. We see republicanism in Article 4, Section 4, when the states are required to also provide some sort of Republican form of government, right? So just remember that republicanism is different than popular sovereignty in the fact that republicanism has to do with actually voting for a representative to then go to government to make decisions for you. Another aspect of the principles is going to be federalism. I want you to make sure that you understand that federalism is the division of the power in our system of government between the different levels of government. So we don't just have one government in the United States, we have multiple governments. So powers are divided amongst different levels of state, national, and local governments. We can see that in the Constitution through the delegated powers to the national government, Article 10 and the reserved powers, and then the concurrent powers that both the federal government and state and local governments share. People often get confused with federalism and separation of powers. Separation of powers is the actual division of power between different branches of government. And the branches of government can exist at all those different levels. So when we separate powers, what we are trying to do is make sure that one branch of government doesn't get too powerful and overtake the other branch of government. So the legislative branch has been given the power to make laws. The executive branch has been given the power to execute or carry those laws out. And then the judicial branch has been given the power to interpret those laws. We find that division of power in Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the Constitution. Just notice that this is different from federalism in the fact that we can also see separation of powers at those levels. So the federal government has a legislative, executive, and judicial branch. The state government has a legislative, executive, and judicial branch. And then also the local governments have legislative, executive, and judicial branches. So each level of government under federalism has the powers separated into 3 different branches. Based off of separation of powers, we run into the principle of checks and balances. Checks and balances is this idea that we want to make sure that no single branch of government has more power or overtakes another branch of government. We also helps them to make sure that they are working together. So you can see throughout the Constitution ways, as the illustration shows, that one branch of government is needed for another branch of government to carry out its powers effectively, and it holds them in check. So it can be as simple as the president being able to veto a piece of legislation passed by Congress, or Congress then being able to override that override that presidential veto. It could also be the fact that Congress has to approve presidential appointments, or that the judicial branch has the power of judicial review, which checks on all 3. So checks and balances is one of the essential principles of this Constitution to make sure that no branch of government has too much undue authority and overtakes the other branches of government. It keeps them in check and holds them accountable. The United States Constitution is also founded in the idea of limited government. Make sure that you understand that our Constitution is not something that grants power, it limits power. It specifically states that everyone, citizens and powerful leaders alike, must obey the law. So there's this idea that no one is above the law. So limited government also kind of works its way into the concept of rule of law as well. We can find limited government in Article 1, Section 9, where you have specific denied powers. And you can also find it in the 10th Amendment, where powers are reserved to the states. Judicial review is also a principle that is based in the Constitution and the empowerment of a judicial branch. Prior to the Constitution, we didn't have a federal judiciary. It was solely based at the states. So Article 3 established a federal judiciary. The idea of the federal judiciary was to look at actions, not only laws, but actions of the executive branch as well, through executive orders or actions of agencies, to determine whether or not those actions were constitutional. So that is their power to interpret the law, to be able to look at the Constitution, look at the action, and to determine whether that action is constitutional under the powers that have been granted to government. Whenever we look at the power of judicial review, you're not going to find the words judicial review in the Constitution. The first action of the Supreme Court to overturn a piece of legislation was in the court case Marbury versus Madison. So that is really the example that you would use for judicial review, because it's the first time where a Supreme Court, under the guidance of Chief Justice John Marshall, actually determined that a piece of legislation was unconstitutional. When we talk about securing the rights and the blessings of liberty in the goals, one of the ways that they ensured that our rights were going to be secured was through the Bill of Rights. So individual rights are the idea that, remember with John Locke, that we have natural rights. We have the right to life, liberty, and property. And one of the reasons that we enter into government's a social contract with government, and we agree to a certain amount of order, is so that they will protect our rights. Our individual rights are guaranteed to us by birth, but in the Constitution, they established our individual rights as an assurance in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So the Bill of Rights becomes the example of our individual rights. What you're going to do from this point is you're going to go to review two of the major aspects of, of the principles, and I want you to go to, let me see here. Let me pull it up this way. I want you to move to the crash course videos. On the link, you are going to find these documents right here. And there's also a link to 2 crash course videos on YouTube. These will serve as a review, and another person will be giving you some information about 3 of probably the most major principles in the Constitution that we want to look at: separation of powers, checks and balances, and then also if you scroll down, you'll see the other one, which is federalism, right? This is just requiring you to click on the link for YouTube. Each video should be approximately 6 to 9 minutes. As you're watching the video, I just want you to fill in the information that corresponds with the blanks. All right, and this will just primarily serve to review you through the information that you were looking at in the PowerPoint, and maybe give you another perspective of it and have someone explain it to you just a little bit further. So just use this as a review and a chance to gain a little bit more information, more specific to what separation of powers and separation of powers and federalism and checks and balances is talking about. The last thing that I want you to accomplish with this task is I want you to find some examples on your own. So this is really where you're going to be applying the information that you've learned. So you should also find a current event activity. Give me just a second to pull it up. All right. It's entitled Constitutional Principles, and it is pretty self-explanatory, but let me give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. Here's what you're going to do. Down the left-hand side, you see the principles of the Constitution that we have talked about. It doesn't include all principles of the Constitution, but you're going to mainly focus on limited government, republicanism, separation of powers, checks and balances, popular sovereignty, and federalism. The 2 that are left out from the PowerPoint are individual liberties and judicial review. But we're going to focus on these for this activity. All I'm asking you to do, or all the task is asking you to do, is to look at some current events. And these current events can come from what's taking place in the news today, in the past month. And you can look at magazines, you can look at newspapers, you can look online, you can look at hard copies, however best it suits you to be able to do that. But I want you to find some current events and see if you can, with that current event, apply one of these constitutional principles. So obviously it's going to be talking about things that are taking place as far as our government is concerned. Let me give you a good example from what's going on in today's news. If I were to come down here with federalism, I would probably be very easy to find some information in the news today about federalism. So if you're watching, and you can watch the news as well. So if you want to watch one of the local news stations or one of the network stations for like NBC, CBS, ABC, you can watch PBS, anything that you're trying to get as far as the news is concerned, wherever you get your news sources from. But I would find a story or something that they're reporting on. And in the first blank, all I'm going to do is it's asking me to basically provide a current event in which the constitutional principle may apply. So I want to just give a brief synopsis of what that current event is about. So right now going on, I could have probably found stories where you have states at this moment trying to make decisions about whether or not they're going to open up their businesses after we have been in kind of a shutdown mode for COVID-19. You see different discussions in the news as they're reporting on different governors making these decisions, whether there should be guidelines from the federal government or should it be left up to the states. Should it be left up to the local level? Even here in the state of Tennessee, different counties are doing it at different times as instructed by the governor. So Knox County, for example, is opening up a little bit ahead of other counties surrounding us because we have a local health department. Those are perfect examples of federalism because remember that the power of government is divided between levels of government. So local, state, and national are making different decisions based on their powers at their levels. So that's a good example of federalism. If they're talking about, over the past few months, we've been talking about primaries and elections. We have a presidential election coming up in November. We've had primaries trying to determine the Democratic nominee. Those are good stories or news stories of examples of Republicanism because that's an example of the people trying to elect representatives to represent them. So you can feel free to go back a few months or what's going on currently. And all you need to do on this activity is write down the heading or the title of your current event or the title of the news story. I would also source it, tell where you got that current event, whether it was from a local newspaper like the Knoxville News Sentinel. It may be from more of a national newspaper like the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post or the USA Today. It could be the Nightly News, WBIR, a local news station, PBS, just wherever you received that information from. Go ahead and source it, put the date, and then over here on the rationale, just give a few details about what the story is talking about and how you can relate that to the principle of the Constitution. So what made you think that this was an article or a story about limited government or republicanism or separation of powers, right? At the end of this task, you should be able to have a pretty good foundational knowledge of what those principles of the Constitution are and how we see those still today, over 200 years later, in our everyday discussions about the role of government, the purpose of government, and how we should be interpreting our Constitution. I hope that this has helped you to understand this task, and feel free to reach out with questions if you are still a little bit confused through email. Thanks so much, and I appreciate it.